During World War II, Japan faced significant losses in naval warfare, particularly as the United States intensified its island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. In response, the Japanese Imperial Navy sought unconventional weapons that could inflict maximum damage on enemy fleets with minimal resources. This led to the development of Kaiten, a special type of manned suicide submarine designed to operate as a human-guided torpedo. Unlike traditional torpedoes, which were launched and controlled remotely, Kaiten were piloted by a single person who would guide the explosive-laden craft toward an enemy ship, ensuring a direct hit by sacrificing their own life in the process. The term Kaiten translates to turn of heaven or heaven shaker, reflecting the spiritual and nationalistic ideology behind the weapon. The idea was that these submariners, much like the aerial kamikaze pilots, would embrace a noble death for their country, striking fear into the hearts of the enemy while delivering devastating blows to U.S. naval forces. The development of these submarines was fueled by Japan's growing desperation as its fleet suffered heavy losses against superior American firepower and intelligence. Kaiten were initially created by modifying existing Type 93 torpedoes, also known as the Long Lance. Engineers fitted them with small compartments to accommodate a single pilot, periscope, rudimentary controls, and an explosive warhead at the front. These submarines were typically launched from larger mother submarines, allowing them to approach enemy vessels undetected before making their final attack. The pilot had only one mission: to maneuver the Kaiten toward an American warship and detonate upon impact, annihilating both the target and themselves in the process. Although they were hailed as a revolutionary weapon in Japan, the effectiveness of the Kaiten was questionable. Many missions ended in failure due to mechanical issues, detection by enemy sonar, or difficulties in steering toward moving targets. Additionally, launching a Kaiten required a great deal of precision, and even when successfully deployed, pilots had to contend with rough seas, poor visibility, and evasive maneuvers by enemy ships. Despite these challenges, the Japanese military pushed forward with the Kaiten program, believing that the psychological impact of a weapon piloted by men willing to die would be as significant as the physical destruction it could cause. The program was kept highly secretive, with only select young naval officers chosen for training. These individuals were indoctrinated with nationalistic ideals and trained rigorously for their one-way missions, often writing farewell letters to their families before departing on what they knew would be their final journey. These submarines were essentially human-guided torpedoes. The Kaiten were not conventional submarines in the traditional sense. Rather, they were modified torpedoes designed to be controlled by a human pilot instead of an automated guidance system. Unlike standard torpedoes, which were fired and left to follow a predetermined course or rely on simple homing mechanisms, the Kaiten required an onboard operator to manually steer the vessel towards target. This approach was meant to increase accuracy, especially against moving enemy ships that could evade standard torpedo attacks. Structurally, the Kaiten was a cylindrical, self-propelled underwater missile, typically about 48 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. Inside, the pilot was confined to an extremely tight space, seated in a cramped cockpit with limited controls. The control panel allowed for steering adjustments, speed modulation, and periscope operation to help the pilot navigate. However, visibility was a major issue. Pilots had to rely on primitive optics and guesswork to reach their targets. Once a Kaiten was launched, there was no turning back. It had no escape mechanism, no way to be retrieved, and no secondary function other than to explode upon impact. The Kaiten were usually launched from larger mother submarines, which would approach enemy fleets under cover of darkness or deep underwater. Once in position, the mother submarine would surface briefly to deploy the Kaiten, after which the pilot would take full control of the weapon and begin a high-speed attack run toward an enemy vessel. Each Kaiten was equipped with an explosive warhead, often filled with up to 3,400 pounds, 1,550 kilograms, of explosives, making them capable of delivering massive damage if they successfully hit their target. Despite being built to maximize impact, the design of the Kaiten had significant flaws. The vessels were extremely difficult to maneuver, requiring the pilot to make constant adjustments while dealing with ocean currents and enemy evasive actions. Unlike aerial kamikaze planes, which had a clear visual path to their targets, Kaiten pilots operated largely in the blind, relying on outdated periscopes and rough estimations of distance and speed. This made successful attacks rare and highly dependent on luck as much as skill. Another major issue was that the Kaiten had limited operational range. Once launched, they had only a short amount of time before running out of fuel, meaning they had to locate and reach an enemy vessel quickly. If they failed, they would simply sink to the ocean floor or detonate prematurely. Some Kaiten pilots were lost without ever engaging in combat, falling victim to malfunctions, self-detonations, or countermeasures deployed by U.S. warships. Despite these drawbacks, Japan continued to use Kaiten in hopes that their psychological impact would instill fear in the enemy. The idea of a torpedo actively being controlled by a human who could adjust course in real time was meant to be an improvement over conventional torpedoes. However, while the concept seemed effective in theory, its execution in real battles proved far less successful than Japan had hoped. The program was developed as a last-ditch effort to stop U.S. advances. By 1944, Japan was losing its grip on the Pacific. The United States, through its island-hopping strategy, had captured key territories, cutting off Japan's supply lines and crippling its ability to wage war effectively. The once dominant Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered devastating defeats at battles such as Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, leaving Japan with few options to counter the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. military. As American forces moved closer to the Japanese mainland, desperation grew within Japan's high command. Traditional naval warfare was proving ineffective against the superior numbers and advanced technology of the U.S. Navy. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines worked in coordination to neutralize Japanese threats before they could inflict serious damage. This led Japanese military planners to consider alternative strategies, ones that prioritized psychological shock and tactical unpredictability over conventional success. The development of Kaiten submarines was born from this desperate need to turn the tide of war in Japan's favor, even if it meant sacrificing the lives of their own sailors. The Kaiten program was not an entirely new concept, but rather an adaptation of Japan's growing use of suicide tactics. Around the same time, kamikaze pilots were being deployed to crash their planes into U.S. warships, accepting certain death to inflict as much damage as possible. This philosophy of self-sacrifice had deep roots in Japan's militaristic culture, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and dying for the emperor rather than surrendering. The Kaiten was an extension of this ideology, transferring the concept from the air to the sea. The decision to invest in Kaiten development was also influenced by Japan's lack of industrial resources. By 1944, Japan's shipbuilding capabilities were severely diminished due to U.S. bombing raids and material shortages. Producing large warships and submarines became increasingly difficult, forcing Japan to look for low-cost, high-impact alternatives. A Kaiten was relatively inexpensive to produce compared to a full-sized warship, and because it relied on a human pilot instead of complex targeting systems, it was seen as a practical solution for attacking U.S. naval forces. Training for Kaiten pilots was rushed due to the urgency of Japan's military situation. Young naval officers, often in their late teens or early 20s, were selected for the program and subjected to rigorous training in piloting and navigation. They were taught to embrace death as a noble act, writing farewell letters to their families and participating in emotional farewell ceremonies before embarking on missions. Many of these men, while patriotic, were also manipulated into believing that their sacrifice would bring Japan victory, despite the overwhelming odds against them. As Japan's situation grew more dire, the Kaiten program was expanded, and more submarines were retrofitted to carry these manned torpedoes. Japanese military planners hoped that even if Kaiten could not completely turn the tide of war, they could at least slow down U.S. advances, force America to be more cautious in its naval operations, and perhaps even instill fear among U.S. sailors. However, The reality of Kaiten warfare was far less effective than its planners had envisioned. Pilots were trained to die for their country, similar to kamikaze pilots. The Kaiten pilots were among the most devoted soldiers of Japan's wartime forces, handpicked and rigorously trained for their ultimate mission, to sacrifice themselves in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of war. Much like the kamikaze pilots of the Imperial Japanese Air Force, these young men were not merely trained for combat, but were mentally conditioned to embrace death as an honor rather than a loss. Their mission was not to survive, but to ensure their own destruction in order to take down as many enemy vessels as possible. Recruitment for Kaiten pilots primarily targeted young, patriotic naval officers who were already trained in submarine operations. Many of them were in their late teens or early 20s, idealistic and willing to serve their country in any way possible. However, while some volunteered with enthusiasm, others were subtly coerced, pressured by the deep-rooted ideology that surrender was shameful and that death in battle was the ultimate act of loyalty to the emperor. The training process for Kaiten pilots was intense and emotionally taxing. It began with classroom instruction on navigation, mechanics, and targeting. Pilots had to understand how to operate the vessel in complete darkness and under extreme pressure. Unlike traditional submariners, Kaiten pilots had no escape routes. Their training focused entirely on how to guide their explosive-filled craft to an enemy ship with precision before detonating on impact. Beyond technical skills, the psychological conditioning was equally, if not more, important. Kaiten pilots underwent a form of spiritual indoctrination that emphasized self-sacrifice as a divine duty. They were told that by giving their lives for Japan, they would achieve immortality in the eyes of their people and ancestors. Many were made to write farewell letters to their families before even being assigned a mission, reinforcing the idea that their deaths were not just possible, but inevitable. Training exercises included simulated attack runs, where pilots practiced maneuvering their Kaiten through the water, often with a chase submarine monitoring their progress. Unlike standard submariners, who trained for long missions with the goal of returning home, Kaiten pilots trained with the explicit understanding that their missions were one-way journeys. They lived under the constant awareness that once they were launched, they would never return. As part of their psychological preparation, farewell ceremonies were held before missions. These ceremonies often included traditional rituals, with pilots given white headbands, hachimaki, symbolizing their bravery and dedication. They were treated as heroes before they even set out, with high-ranking officers honoring them as warriors whose sacrifice would help protect the empire. This reinforced their sense of purpose, making it psychologically difficult for them to back out, even if they had doubts. Despite the fervor and commitment instilled in them, some Kaiten pilots reportedly struggled with fear and internal conflict. While they had been trained to see their deaths as honorable, the reality of climbing into a small, confined torpedo with no escape weighed heavily on them. Some questioned whether their sacrifice would truly make a difference in the war, but by the time they were assigned to a mission, there was little room for hesitation. The first successful Kaiten attack was on November 20th, 1944. By late 1944, Japan's situation in the Pacific was deteriorating rapidly. The U.S. had gained control of crucial islands, and its naval forces were increasingly dominant. In response, Japan launched the Kaiten program into active combat, hoping that these human-guided torpedoes would inflict significant damage on the U.S. fleet. After months of testing and training, the first operational Kaiten mission was carried out on November 20th, 1944, with the attack on the U.S. fleet anchored at Ulithi Atoll. This marked the first confirmed use of Kaiten in battle and demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of this desperate tactic. Ulithi Atoll, located in the Western Pacific, was a critical anchorage for the U.S. Navy. It served as a staging area for American warships preparing for operations against Japanese-held islands, making it a prime target for Japan's new suicide weapon. On November 20th, the Japanese submarine I-47 approached the atoll undetected, carrying multiple Kaiten torpedoes. Its crew carefully maneuvered into position and launched the human-guided torpedoes toward the anchored American fleet. One of the Kaiten found its mark, striking the USS Mississauga, a large oil tanker. The impact caused a massive explosion, igniting the highly flammable fuel stored on board. Flames rapidly engulfed the vessel, sending towering plumes of smoke into the sky and causing chaos among nearby ships. The inferno raged for hours before the Mississauga capsized and sank, becoming the first confirmed victim of a Kaiten attack. This was hailed as a success by the Japanese, who saw it as proof that Kaiten could be a deadly weapon against the superior U.S. Navy. Despite this apparent victory, the attack also exposed major weaknesses in the Kaiten program. Of the multiple Kaiten launched during the attack, only one was confirmed to have hit its target. The others either missed, malfunctioned, or neutralized before reaching an enemy vessel. This highlighted the inherent difficulties in controlling a manually guided torpedo under combat conditions. The U.S. Navy, though shocked by the attack, quickly adapted its defensive strategies, implementing more aggressive anti-submarine measures to detect and destroy Kaiten-carrying submarines before they could launch their deadly payloads. For Japan, the success of the Mississauga attack was seen as proof that the Kaiten could work, leading to further missions in the coming months. However, the operational challenges soon became evident. While the attack on Ulithi Atoll demonstrated the psychological and destructive power of Kaiten, it also underscored the program's limitations, high failure rates, vulnerability to detection, and the immense sacrifice required for limited results. The USS Mississauga was the first confirmed victim of a Kaiten. On November 20th, 1944, the USS Mississauga, AO-59, a large American fleet oiler, became the first confirmed victim of a Japanese Kaiten attack. The ship was anchored at Ulithi Atoll, a crucial U.S. naval staging area in the Western Pacific, where the U.S. Navy refueled and resupplied its warships before launching major offensives against Japanese-held territories. This location was a prime target for Japan, as striking a vessel there could disrupt the American fleet's ability to continue its aggressive push toward the Japanese mainland. The attack was carried out by the Japanese submarine I-47, which was part of a secret mission to test the effectiveness of Kaiten in real combat. The submarine managed to slip past enemy defenses undetected, creeping toward Ulithi before launching several of its human-guided torpedoes. One of these Kaiten successfully locked onto the Mississauga and detonated against its hull. The impact caused a massive explosion, igniting the highly flammable aviation fuel stored in the ship's tanks. Within seconds, a towering fireball erupted from the ship, sending shockwaves across the water and alerting the entire fleet to the unfolding disaster. As the fire spread uncontrollably, the crew of the Mississauga scrambled to abandon ship. The inferno consumed everything in its path, and despite desperate firefighting efforts, it became clear that the vessel was doomed. Within a few hours, the ship capsized and sank, taking with it several crew members who were unable to escape. The attack shocked the American forces, as it marked the first time they had encountered a weapon like the Kaiten, a torpedo controlled by a suicidal pilot rather than a machine. The destruction of the Mississauga demonstrated both the potential and the challenges of using Kaiten in battle. While the Japanese celebrated the sinking as a success, hoping it would strike fear into the U.S. Navy, the broader impact of the attack was limited. American forces quickly learned from the incident and adapted their defensive strategies to counter future Kaiten threats. U.S. anti-submarine warfare measures were intensified, and patrols around key naval bases were increased, making it more difficult for Japanese submarines to get close enough to launch Kaiten successfully. For Japan, the sinking of the Mississauga provided propaganda value, boosting morale and reinforcing the belief that Kaiten could be a viable weapon despite its high failure rate. However, the strategic effect of the attack was minimal. The loss of a single fleet oiler, while significant, did not alter the course of the war. The U.S. Navy, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, was able to replace lost ships quickly, ensuring that the American war effort remained on track despite such attacks. The U.S. Navy quickly adapted and improved defenses against Kaiten attacks. The sinking of the USS Mississauga in November 1944 was a wake-up call for the U.S. Navy. Up until that point, the primary threats at sea had been enemy ships, aircraft, and conventional torpedoes. The appearance of a new kind of weapon, a manned suicide submarine capable of adjusting its course and actively seeking out its target, forced American naval commanders to rethink their defensive strategies. The idea of a torpedo that could be manually guided until the moment of impact introduced a new level of unpredictability and danger. However, while the Kaiten was a novel and terrifying weapon, it was far from unstoppable. In response to the attack, the U.S. Navy immediately began implementing new countermeasures to detect and destroy Kaiten-carrying submarines before they could launch their deadly payloads. One of the first changes was an increased focus on anti-submarine warfare, ASW, which involved more aggressive patrolling of naval staging areas, such as Ulithi Atoll. American destroyers and patrol boats were deployed in greater numbers, using sonar to detect enemy submarines lurking beneath the surface. If a Japanese submarine was detected, depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine weapons were used to destroy it before it could deploy its Kaiten. Another key adaptation was the strengthening of perimeter defenses around anchorages and fleet positions. The U.S. Navy began deploying anti-torpedo nets in strategic locations, particularly around vulnerable ships such as aircraft carriers, battleships, and supply vessels. These heavy-duty nets were designed to stop or detonate torpedoes before they could reach their target. While they were primarily meant for traditional torpedoes, they also had some effectiveness against Kaiten, which had to navigate around them to reach their intended targets. Additionally, the U.S. Navy trained its lookouts and radar operators to recognize the signs of a Kaiten attack. Because Kaiten pilots had to raise a small periscope to navigate toward their targets, vigilant spotters on American ships were able to detect the telltale disturbances in the water. Once spotted, destroyers or aircraft could quickly move in to neutralize the threat. This heightened level of awareness helped prevent some Kaiten attacks before they could cause damage. The U.S. also modified its tactics for handling Japanese submarine threats. Instead of waiting for an attack, American forces became more proactive in seeking out enemy submarines. Hunter-killer groups, consisting of destroyers working in coordination with anti-submarine aircraft, were deployed to track and eliminate Japanese submarines before they could get close enough to launch Kaiten. These operations became increasingly successful as U.S. intelligence efforts allowed the Navy to anticipate enemy movements and intercept Kaiten-equipped submarines before they could strike. Despite these improvements in defense, some Kaiten attacks still managed to succeed, and Japan continued using them throughout the remainder of the war. However, the effectiveness of these suicide torpedoes declined as the U.S. Navy refined its countermeasures. By mid-1945, the vast majority of Kaiten missions ended in failure, with many submarines being sunk before they could launch their attacks. Even when Kaiten were deployed, most failed to reach their targets due to mechanical issues, defensive measures, or the evasive actions of American warships. While the Kaiten was a desperate attempt by Japan to slow the U.S. advance, it ultimately proved to be an unreliable and costly weapon as the U.S. Navy adapted quickly and decisively to counter the threat. Many Kaiten missions ended in failure due to mechanical issues and U.S. countermeasures. Although the Kaiten was conceived as a weapon that could strike fear into the U.S. Navy and inflict significant damage, the reality was far different. Many Kaiten missions ended in failure, with little to no impact on American naval operations. A combination of technical malfunctions, human error, and effective U.S. defensive measures resulted in most Kaiten attacks failing before they could reach their intended targets. Despite the dedication of the pilots and the determination of Japanese commanders to make the weapon a success, the Kaiten program ultimately proved to be unreliable and costly. One of the primary reasons for failure was mechanical unreliability. The Kaiten was essentially a modified torpedo with a small cockpit for a pilot, but its design was rushed into production due to Japan's desperate situation. As a result, Many Kaitens suffered from engine malfunctions, control system failures, and problems with their guidance mechanisms. Some pilots reported issues with steering, making it difficult to accurately navigate toward an enemy ship. Others found that their periscopes, necessary for aiming, fogged up, broke, or failed to provide a clear enough view. In some cases, the Kaiten even detonated prematurely, either due to faulty warheads or accidental collisions with underwater obstacles. Even when a Kaiten was successfully launched from its mother submarine, it faced numerous external challenges that reduced its chances of success. Ocean currents could push the Kaiten off course, making it difficult for pilots to correct their trajectory. The limited visibility underwater meant that pilots had to rely on guesswork and rough estimations, increasing the likelihood of missing their targets. Unlike kamikaze aircraft, which had a clear visual path to their targets, Kaiten pilots had to navigate blindly in many cases. U.S. defensive measures also played a crucial role in neutralizing the Kaiten threat. After the attack on the USS Mississauga, the U.S. Navy intensified its anti-submarine efforts, making it much harder for Japanese submarines to get close enough to launch Kaiten. American destroyers and aircraft patrolled the waters aggressively, using sonar to detect and destroy submarines before they could launch their weapons. Anti-torpedo nets were placed around key ships and anchorages, creating physical barriers that Kaiten could not easily bypass. When Kaiten were detected in the water, U.S. warships used evasive maneuvers to escape potential impacts. Since Kaiten were piloted torpedoes, they required precise aiming and control to be effective. If a target ship changed direction at the right moment, a Kaiten could completely miss, running out of fuel before it could correct its course. Unlike conventional torpedoes, which followed a predetermined path, Kaiten required constant human input, making them vulnerable to unexpected movements by enemy ships. Beyond mechanical and tactical failures, many Kaiten missions ended in disaster before they even began. Some Japanese submarines carrying Kaiten were intercepted and sunk before launching their weapons. Others encountered technical issues that forced them to abort their missions. There were even cases where Kaiten pilots died during training exercises due to malfunctions or accidents. Despite Japan's continued efforts to refine the Kaiten and improve its success rate, the weapon never lived up to its intended potential. By mid-1945, the U.S. Navy had become highly effective at countering Kaiten attacks, and the Japanese submarine force suffered heavy losses. The combination of design flaws, pilot difficulties, and U.S. defenses meant that the Kaiten was ultimately more of a psychological weapon than a practical one. The Kaiten program was costly for Japan, both in resources and human lives. The Kaiten program, while conceived as a desperate measure to counter the overwhelming superiority of the U.S. Navy, ended up being an enormous burden on Japan, both in terms of material resources and human lives. Although the program was designed as a relatively low-cost solution to Japan's dwindling war capabilities, the actual expenses, both financial and human, proved to be far greater than anticipated. From a material standpoint, the Kaiten program drained valuable resources at a time when Japan was already struggling with shortages. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was suffering from severe constraints in fuel, steel, and shipbuilding materials due to relentless American bombing campaigns and effective naval blockades. Every Kaiten required a substantial amount of steel and engineering effort to construct. Though smaller than traditional submarines, they still required complex components, including propulsion systems, explosive warheads, and navigation equipment. More importantly, each Kaiten was not a reusable weapon. Unlike traditional torpedoes, which could be produced in bulk and fired remotely, Kaiten were piloted suicide weapons, meaning that every launch required not just a new Kaiten, but also the loss of a trained pilot. In addition, the mother submarines that carried the Kaiten had to be specially modified to launch these human-guided torpedoes, reducing their own operational effectiveness. Many of these submarines were sunk before they could even deploy their Kaiten, further wasting valuable military assets. Beyond the material cost, the human cost was even more devastating. The Kaiten program required highly trained young men who were willing or coerced to sacrifice themselves in battle. These were not just ordinary soldiers. Many were bright, educated, and skilled naval officers who could have served Japan in other ways. Instead, they were sent on one-way missions with little hope of success. Many of these young men were in their late teens or early 20s, having undergone rigorous training not just in piloting the Kaiten, but also in embracing the idea of self-sacrifice as an honorable duty. Japan's militaristic culture at the time emphasized loyalty to the emperor and the nation above all else. Kaiten pilots were subjected to intense psychological conditioning, reinforcing the idea that dying in battle was a noble and glorious act. They were often given farewell ceremonies before their missions, where they wrote final letters to their families, received headbands, hachimaki, symbolizing their bravery, and drank ceremonial sake as part of their send-off. These rituals, while meant to instill a sense of purpose, also reinforced the grim reality that they would not return. Despite their devotion, most Kaiten pilots never even reached their targets. Many were lost at sea due to mechanical failures, sunk along with their mother submarines, or intercepted by American anti-submarine patrols. In many cases, they died without ever engaging the enemy, making their sacrifice all the more tragic. Unlike kamikaze pilots, who at least had the possibility of maneuvering their aircraft toward a direct hit, Kaiten pilots often faced insurmountable obstacles before even getting close to a U.S. ship. As the war progressed, the failures of the Kaiten program became evident. By 1945, Japan was losing more submarines carrying Kaiten than the number of enemy ships actually being sunk by the weapon. The human and material losses far outweighed any strategic gains, yet Japan continued to deploy them in desperation, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. The ultimate cost was staggering. Hundreds of young men perished in missions that largely ended in failure, and valuable submarines were lost, further weakening Japan's already crippled navy. The Kaiten program reflected Japan's increasing desperation in the final years of World War II. By 1944, Japan was facing a dire military situation in the Pacific. The United States had gained the upper hand, systematically capturing island after island, bringing the war closer to Japan's homeland. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a dominant force in the Pacific, was now struggling under relentless American naval and air superiority. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and supply lines were being destroyed at an alarming rate, while U.S. industrial power continued to churn out warships and planes at a pace Japan simply could not match. With conventional tactics failing and resources dwindling, Japan turned to extreme measures to counter the overwhelming American advance. Suicide missions became a common strategy, as military leaders viewed them as a way to inflict significant damage without relying on expensive, large-scale naval operations. The infamous kamikaze air attacks, where pilots deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships, were already in full force. The introduction of the Kaiten program was an extension of this same philosophy. If Japan could no longer compete with the U.S. Navy in open combat, it would resort to self-sacrificial weapons in hopes of shifting the tide. The decision to deploy Kaiten was not just a military one. It was deeply tied to Japan's cultural and political ideology at the time. Japanese society was heavily influenced by Bushido, the samurai code of honor that emphasized loyalty, self-sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to one's duty. Surrender was seen as dishonorable, and death in battle was considered the ultimate form of devotion to the emperor and the nation. This mindset was actively encouraged by military leaders, who framed Kaiten pilots as modern samurai, making the ultimate sacrifice for Japan's survival. However, the reliance on suicide tactics also highlighted the sheer desperation of Japan's war effort. While the U.S. Navy was focusing on technological advancements, strategic planning, and overwhelming production power, Japan was investing in one-way missions that, while terrifying, were largely ineffective in stopping the American advance. The Kaiten program was an acknowledgement that Japan could no longer win through conventional means. It had to rely on fear, unpredictability, and individual sacrifice to keep fighting. The hurried development of the Kaiten also reflected Japan's declining ability to conduct proper research and development. Unlike earlier Japanese submarine designs, which were carefully engineered and tested, the Kaiten was rushed into production with numerous mechanical flaws and operational limitations. The urgency of war meant that many of these problems were ignored or overlooked in favor of immediate deployment. This desperation led to high failure rates, with many Kaiten either malfunctioning, missing their targets, or being destroyed before they could launch. Despite these issues, the Kaiten program was pursued aggressively because Japan had few other options left. The war effort was collapsing, and military leaders clung to the hope that suicide weapons could still make a difference. By the time Kaiten were being deployed in larger numbers, the U.S. Navy had already adapted its tactics, making it increasingly difficult for Kaiten missions to succeed. Many were neutralized before they could do any damage, rendering the sacrifice of their pilots effectively meaningless. As the war neared its end, Japan's desperation became even more evident. Kaiten production continued despite mounting losses, and young pilots were still being sent on missions that had little chance of success. While the concept of the Kaiten may have been born out of a tactical necessity, its continued use until the war's final days showed just how hopeless Japan's situation had become. A nation that once prided itself on its naval strength was now relying on suicidal last-ditch efforts to fight an unwinnable war. Kaiten pilots were glorified as heroes, but many felt fear and doubt before their missions. The young men chosen to pilot Kaiten suicide submarines were often portrayed in Japanese propaganda as the bravest warriors of the empire, selflessly sacrificing their lives for the greater good of their country. Official narratives emphasize their honor, patriotism, and unwavering commitment to Japan's survival, likening them to ancient samurai who embraced death in battle without hesitation. However, behind the carefully crafted image of fearless devotion, many Kaiten pilots struggled with fear, doubt, and the emotional weight of their impending deaths. Most Kaiten pilots were young naval officers in their late teens or early 20s, handpicked for their intelligence, loyalty, and physical fitness. They underwent extensive training, not only in operating the Kaiten itself, but also in embracing the ideology of self-sacrifice. They were subjected to constant reinforcement of the idea that their deaths would be meaningful, that their sacrifice would help protect Japan and bring honor to their families. Many were given farewell ceremonies before their missions, during which they received headbands, hachimaki, symbolizing courage, drank ceremonial sake, and wrote final letters to their families. These rituals were meant to strengthen their resolve, but for many, they were also a painful reminder that they would never return. Despite the intense psychological conditioning, many Kaiten pilots secretly wrestled with fear and uncertainty. Unlike kamikaze pilots, who had some degree of visibility and control in their final moments, Kaiten pilots were enclosed in a small, claustrophobic metal tube cut off from the outside world once they were launched. They knew that once they were inside, there was no turning back. If the mission failed or they missed their target, they would either drown or be trapped in the depths of the ocean until they ran out of oxygen. Some pilots confided their fears in personal diaries and letters, expressing their deep sorrow at leaving behind their families, their dreams, and the futures they would never have. Adding to the psychological torment was the high failure rate of Kaiten missions. Many pilots knew that previous attacks had ended in disaster, with their comrades perishing without inflicting any damage on the enemy. They were aware that Kaiten often malfunctioned, missed their targets, or were detected and destroyed before reaching their destinations. Some questioned whether their deaths would truly make a difference in the war, or if they were simply being thrown away in a desperate, losing battle. For those who were still hesitant, there was little room for refusal. Backing out of a Kaiten mission was considered dishonorable, and Japanese military culture at the time placed immense pressure on soldiers to accept their duty without hesitation. While some volunteers joined willingly, others felt trapped by societal expectations and the fear of bringing shame upon their families. Some pilots were persuaded or coerced into volunteering, knowing that refusing would make them appear weak or disloyal. Despite these internal struggles, most Kaiten pilots went through with their missions, driven by a mix of duty, resignation, and the hope that their sacrifice might make a difference. They left behind farewell letters filled with words of love and pride, even as their hearts were heavy with sorrow. Some wrote about their dreams of a future they would never see, while others tried to reassure their families that they were at peace with their fate. These letters remain haunting reminders of the human cost of Japan's desperation in the final years of World War II. Young men who should have had long lives ahead of them, instead sent to die in a weapon that, more often than not, failed to achieve its purpose. The use of Kaiten submarines was part of a broader pattern of Japan's reliance on suicide tactics. By the final years of World War II, Japan had turned increasingly to suicide warfare as a response to the overwhelming military superiority of the United States. The Kaiten program was not an isolated development. Rather, it was part of a much larger shift in Japan's strategy, one that saw human sacrifice as a necessary means to counteract dwindling resources, technological disadvantages, and the relentless advance of Allied forces. Japan's reliance on suicide tactics can be traced to its deeply ingrained military culture and ideology. The concept of sacrificing one's life for the emperor and the nation was not new. Japan's warrior class, the samurai, had long adhered to the Bushido Code, which glorified loyalty, honor, and the willingness to die rather than face dishonor. This philosophy was heavily reinforced by the Japanese government and military leadership during the war, with soldiers and pilots being taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace and death in battle was the highest honor. This mindset paved the way for the rise of kamikaze attacks, the most well-known example of Japan's suicide warfare. Beginning in late 1944, kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed their planes into American warships, aiming to cause maximum destruction at the cost of their own lives. These attacks were initially viewed as a desperate but effective countermeasure, as a single successful kamikaze strike could inflict serious damage on enemy vessels. However, as the war progressed, the sheer scale of U.S. production and firepower meant that even thousands of kamikaze pilots could not turn the tide of battle. With kamikaze aircraft already in use, Japan expanded its suicide tactics to other military branches, including the Navy and Army. The Kaiten was born from the same logic. If planes could be used as piloted missiles, why not torpedoes? The idea was that human guidance would increase accuracy and ensure direct hits on enemy ships. However, unlike kamikaze planes, which had a clear visual path to their targets, Kaiten pilots had to navigate blindly through the ocean, often relying on sheer luck and limited instrumentation. Beyond Kaiten, Japan experimented with several other suicide weapons, further demonstrating its increasing desperation. One such weapon was the Shinyo suicide boat, a small, fast motorboat packed with explosives and piloted by a single soldier who would ram into enemy ships. These boats were deployed in large numbers, but were ultimately ineffective, as U.S. forces quickly adapted by detecting and destroying them before they could reach their targets. Similarly, the Oka, cherry blossom, rocket plane was developed as a manned, rocket-powered flying bomb that would be dropped from a larger aircraft before diving at high speeds toward enemy ships. While highly destructive in theory, the Oka was often intercepted before it could reach its target, making it yet another example of Japan's failing suicide strategy. The increasing reliance on human-guided weapons showed that Japan had exhausted its conventional options. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had been severely crippled, its aircraft carriers and battleships largely destroyed. Fuel shortages made it difficult to deploy traditional military assets, and the production of advanced weapons lagged far behind that of the United States. Facing inevitable defeat, Japan turned to suicide warfare not just as a tactic, but as a symbol of defiance and national resolve. However, this approach had devastating consequences, particularly for the young men who were sent to die in these suicide missions. While military leaders viewed them as strategic assets, the reality was that most of these sacrifices were futile. The U.S. Navy quickly adapted to suicide tactics, developing better anti-aircraft defenses, improving sonar detection, and tightening perimeter security around its fleets. As a result, the effectiveness of these weapons declined rapidly, even as Japan continued to send thousands of men to their deaths. Despite the failure of Japan's suicide warfare strategy, it remained a key part of the country's military doctrine until the very end of the war. Even as the Allies closed in on Japan's home islands, the government prepared for an all-out defense that would rely heavily on suicide attacks, with plans to deploy thousands of kamikaze pilots, Kaiten submarines, and other human-guided weapons in one final, desperate stand. The failure of the Kaiten program reflected the overall decline of Japan's naval power in World War II. The Kaiten program was born out of desperation, an attempt to compensate for Japan's rapidly declining naval power as the United States gained dominance in the Pacific. However, its failure was not just due to the inherent flaws of the weapon itself. It was a symptom of the broader collapse of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once been a formidable force but was now outmatched in every aspect of modern naval warfare. At the start of World War II, Japan's navy was one of the most powerful in the world. It had demonstrated its strength in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conquest of Southeast Asia, and early naval victories in the Pacific. The fleet was well-trained, technologically advanced, and supported by some of the most skilled naval aviators in the world. However, by 1943, the tide of war had turned against Japan. The U.S. had significantly ramped up its war production, churning out aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and submarines at a rate Japan simply could not match. The once mighty Imperial Navy was being systematically worn down in a brutal war of attrition. One of the major reasons for Japan's decline was the devastating loss of its aircraft carriers. The battles of Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf saw Japan lose a significant portion of its naval air power. Aircraft carriers had become the dominant force in naval warfare, and with most of its carriers destroyed, Japan was left without the ability to project air superiority over the Pacific. This put Japanese naval operations at a severe disadvantage, as American carrier-based aircraft could now control the seas, locate enemy ships, and launch devastating attacks before Japan's fleet could even engage in battle. Japan also suffered from crippling resource shortages, which severely impacted its ability to maintain and operate a modern navy. The country lacked access to critical raw materials, including oil, steel, and aluminum. With U.S. submarine warfare cutting off supply lines, Japan's fuel reserves were running dangerously low by 1944. This forced the Imperial Navy to limit its naval operations, conserving what little fuel it had for essential missions. Even training new pilots and sailors became difficult due to a lack of resources, further weakening Japan's ability to fight effectively. As Japan's fleet dwindled, its strategy shifted toward unconventional and desperate measures, leading to the creation of suicide weapons like the Kaiten. However, the failure of the Kaiten reflected the broader reality that Japan was no longer capable of conducting large-scale, coordinated naval warfare. The weapon was meant to be a game-changer, a way to strike back at the overwhelming American fleet, but it ultimately proved ineffective. Many Kaiten never reached their targets, and those that did rarely caused enough damage to justify their use. The U.S. Navy quickly adapted to the Kaiten threat, using sonar detection, anti-submarine patrols, and defensive measures to neutralize the attacks before they could cause significant harm. The use of Kaiten also demonstrated how Japan was running out of both time and options. Rather than focusing on long-term military innovation, Japan had resorted to short-term, high-risk strategies that relied on sacrificing human lives. This approach was not sustainable, and as more Kaiten missions ended in failure, it became clear that the program was not a viable solution to Japan's naval decline. Instead of turning the tide of the war, the Kaiten only accelerated Japan's losses, as experienced submarine crews and valuable naval assets were lost in futile attacks. By 1945, Japan's navy was effectively crippled, with most of its major warships either sunk or unable to operate due to fuel shortages. The surviving vessels were often kept in port, unable to challenge the American fleet that now roamed the Pacific uncontested. The Kaiten program, like the kamikaze pilots and other last-ditch suicide weapons, was a reflection of this final stage of Japan's naval decline. An admission that traditional warfare was no longer possible, and all that remained was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The Kaiten program stands as a haunting reminder of the desperation and tragedy that defined Japan's final years in World War II. What was intended as a weapon of last resort ultimately proved to be more costly for Japan than for its enemies, highlighting the stark reality that sheer sacrifice could not overcome overwhelming military superiority. Hundreds of young men perished in missions that often ended in failure, their deaths a testament to a nation struggling against the tide of inevitable defeat. While the Kaiten may not have significantly altered the outcome of the war, its existence reflects the broader story of Japan's declining naval power, its reliance on extreme measures, and the devastating human cost of war. Today, these submarines serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers of militaristic fanaticism and the tragic consequences of war strategies built on sacrifice rather than strategy. As history looks back on the Kaiten and other suicide weapons of World War II, they serve as lessons on the futility of desperation in the face of overwhelming odds. They remind us that war, when pushed to its most extreme, does not just take lives on the battlefield. It consumes the very people it relies on to fight.